What's up guys, it's Daz here, but you don't really care as I've sat down, I've played through all of Hey Pikmin and I now think I'm ready to fully break down and analyze just how good the game is. If you're new to the format of reviewing over on this channel, well, what we do here is we break down games into 10 categories, relevant to the game's goals and aims, and score them each out of 10 for a total score of up to 100. For Hey Pikmin, I've decided to judge it in regards to these categories, as not only is this the same as Pikmin 2's review, but it also just kinda works. I've omitted story from the list as the game isn't really trying to break any records with its story. It's too basic to split into an out of 10 score for that. That being said, let's jump into our first category. Now this doesn't necessarily mean graphics, but rather the artistic style of the game and how well it achieves this. Hey Pikmin is a 2017 3DS game, therefore it is to look fairly good, though obviously the 3DS will give its limitations. That being said, with what this game achieves with this limitation, it is still quite astounding to behold. Looking at the background of every level truly encapsulates the beautiful aesthetic that the Pikmin franchise is always going for. It adds to effectively an atmosphere to each level and reveals little details about the terrain we're exploring. As for the foreground, everything looks crisp and clear, as it should be. Creatures stick out clearly from the background and come in a variety of colours and forms, whilst the Pikmin themselves are prominent to the screen despite the low resolution. The 3D cutscenes also look surprisingly good. In general, I'm quite impressed with how high quality the game looks on the 3DS. The only true gripe I can see with the visuals is the model used for Captain Olimar. He's kept quite significantly low poly, so that it's very clear that his edges are jagged. This is especially prevalent in the 3D cutscenes featuring him, rather than the gameplay screen itself. Whenever we see Olimar within the SS Dolphin 2 or on the ground of the Pikmin Park, it's a pretty prevalent theme that I just can't really ignore. Perhaps the developers kept it this way for an intentional reason, and though it doesn't affect gameplay of the player's experience greatly, it's a detail that bothered me just a little bit. Though in a weird way, I kinda like seeing Olimar in this low poly form. Doesn't mean I won't be docking a point though, visuals get a 9 out of 10. The game looks good, it really does. It effectively highlights what it wants to in a nice and pleasing manner. Admittedly, when I was playing through the game myself, I didn't notice the music too much. It may have been because I was talking throughout most of it and keeping my eye on other things, but still, after looking up the soundtrack and listening to it afterwards, I gotta say, this soundtrack surprised me. And it actually achieved something I feel Pikmin 2 missed the mark on. It kept the soundtrack pretty simplistic, and thus did not get lost in a sea of forgetfulness. Each sector gets its own theme, a select screen theme, a course theme, and a dungeon or cave theme. They work to easily establish the atmosphere and theme of each sector, whilst not bombarding the player with new tracks for each level or just using the nostalgia of the older games, and keeps up just enough variety to not bore with the same tracks over and over. And the music not used during levels are just fantastic. The boss themes especially stand out to really invest the player into the moment with the sudden intensity, whilst the build-up music beforehand works amazingly to create that suspenseful tone. And though it's a simple spin-off, the game is brave enough to push the franchise's soundtrack into newer territory with ever-creeping and unnerving tunes of some of the cave music. Overall, I really enjoyed this soundtrack, and I feel it greatly enhances the player's experience. It doesn't rely too heavily on the main game's tones, but also doesn't sound unlike a Pikmin game. It's charming at the good times, funky when looking back, and a little synthy in the midst of it, and terrifying when it wants to be. Who'd have thought the creators of Yoshi's New Island could have done such a good job? Music gets a 10 out of 10. But now here's the part where I crush your dreams of a 9 out of 10 review. Hey Pikmin has a fair amount of mechanics. Looking at just Olimar's abilities, he could walk, swim, whistle, and use a jetpack, and for the most part, that's all pretty good and simple. There are 5 Pikmin types to play with, all with the usual elemental abilities we've seen throughout the franchise, and you need to collect treasure and Sparkling Seeds as you progress through each level. But here's a few gripes I have. When you throw a Pikmin, they no longer stay in place. They will automatically begin walking back to you if they find nothing to interact with, turning around if they bump into a wall instead. The purpose of the whistle is to bring the Pikmin to you, though it calls the entire visual screen you see rather than a pinpointed area on the map. Usually this will simply mean if a Pikmin is walking around, they will speed up and come towards you, though again turning around at a wall, though faster than before. It's only if they come in contact with you that they are officially part of your party again, meaning you'll have to go out of your way to reach the wandering Pikmin if they get lost. Additionally, if you leave them off screen for too long while they are out in this lost wandering state, they'll die. This is never taught to the player in any kind of tutorial, and took me a while to grasp as a concept. When you're about to lose Pikmin off screen, your Pikmin counter at the top of the screen will flash red. However, I feel this could have used an audio cue to help bring attention to the player, as I often never noticed its warning due to its silent telling on the screen you'll be looking at very little anyway. On top of that, there is no disbanding button, except the jetpack works as a good substitute. When you jetpack away from your Pikmin group, they won't follow you and will just simply stand in place. If you leave them off screen, they'll live forever, because they're not lost. This could have also really done with a tutorial, as it took way too long for me to realize whether the Pikmin were safe or not when I had to leave them behind to go grab a treasure. Something as simple as the ship warning you about losing Pikmin the first time the counter goes red would have been enough, but instead the game throws you in the deep end to learn yourself, which I can understand the argument for, but a suffering tutorial like those we've seen in other Pikmin games would have removed this issue entirely. There's also the mini mechanic against Mokiwis and other similar creatures in which Pikmin can do damage in two ways. They can bump a creature and fly off of them, or they can latch onto a particular part of the body and repeatedly bounce on them for damage. This is a nice idea in concept, but I feel it doesn't work well in practice, as I had issues with hitting this spot throughout my entire playthrough of the game. And while I did find a little issue in actually finding the weak spot on some enemies, this was especially bad for those moments where you're not in an advantageous position, such as fighting a crested Mokiwi head-on in a small cavern. The weak spot is on its crest, but it's facing you. If you miss, or you just don't aim right, then it will immediately eat your Pikmin as you just threw it directly into its mouth. Or alternatively, against a regular Mokiwi, the weak spot is on its back, so you need to master arcing the Pikmin trajectory over its face and onto its back. Go too far and they'll fly right over and potentially get killed on their journey back to your party. I found it very frustrating, as I just never felt like the battle system was fair, and having to wait for creatures to slowly walk towards a wall and then turn around to get the advantage on them was just too time consuming and grueling to be anything close to fun. And don't even get me started on crumb bugs or the elongated crush splats. Their hitboxes and how you fight them was something I never worked out. The actual mechanics of putting out fire was pretty standard, electric gates were easy, swimming was good, though a little bit dicey as your party size grew, and crystals were fun and easy, sure. Flying was also really cool. I liked those mechanics, it's kind of hard to go wrong with them. Bomb rocks also worked really well, giving us an audio cue for explosions was very helpful, and being able to see the impact that the bomb rock would have was a good assistance to the item. Generally though, I wasn't impressed with the mechanics. The lack of an introduction to them was very troubling at the start of the playthrough, and many issues persisted throughout the game. Maybe I'm just not good, but having to be so pinpointed in my accuracy is something I don't care about in a Pikmin game. If my intention is correct, then my action should be too. If I have to be pixel perfect in order to not lose a Pikmin, then I'm not happy. Sorry, mechanics get a 4 out of 10. Moving on, controls. It doesn't get a ton better, I'm afraid. Something I did appreciate is that there was a clear option for left-handed folk like myself, as you can move on with the buttons on the right-hand side of the 3DS as well as the D-pad on the left. The rest of the controls were all touch-based, which is okay as a concept if it's done well, but again, this game has flaws in that regard. Also, it's not 2006 anymore. Oliver's actions are controlled via buttons in the bottom right-hand corner of the touchscreen. But something that really irked me later in the series was the hitbox of the buttons themselves. I almost feel like they were too accurate or too small. The whistle button is in the very corner of the screen, but there's a little bit of space between the buttons and the edge of the screen. Because of this, if I was to touch the very corner of the screen to whistle, I would oftentimes throw Pikmin far ahead of me rather than whistling because of the little gap after the button suggests to throw the Pikmin. I cannot imagine a real scenario where I'd want to throw Pikmin from that point on the screen, especially with the knowledge that the button was there. So I feel the button's hitboxes should have been expanded to actually include the corner of that screen, as I don't have time in the midst of a mid-battle panic to have pinpoint accuracy on the whistle button when I need it. It also felt like a cheap death when it happened. I've also already mentioned my issues with the touch controls in relation to the weak spot mechanic, but another issue I have with the touch controls is the actual trajectory of the Pikmin. I guess this is self-explanatory, but the further you touch away from Olimar, the further the Pikmin fly. And where you touch on the screen is not where they land, just what direction and what amount of power they're thrown with. This is something that took a lot of getting used to for me, and clearly wasn't the most convenient, especially when fighting most creatures. If there was an option to show the trajectory of the Pikmin as you held down on the touchscreen, I feel I as a player would have been able to adapt to the controls much more effectively. As way later in the game, something as simple as having all Pikmin touch some bouncy flowers became an issue, especially with the adjusted trajectory of the yellow Pikmin, who simply fling farther. In fact, when I was first introduced to the yellows, I wasn't aware that distance meant power, and so struggled a lot in having yellows actually reach many creatures in the top screen. It wasn't until later that I realized that there was no universal distance the Pikmin traveled like the previous games, but rather you had to touch the very top of the touchscreen to throw yellow Pikmin high enough. Tutorials and trajectory lines really would have saved me a lot of frustration. Or even an option to not use touch controls would have been helpful. I'm not certain how it would have been worked out fully, but we really need more explanations for the controls of the game. I liked left-handed inclusion though. Controls also gets a 4 out of 10. The only reason it's not lower is I expect some people will say it's my fault for not clicking with the controls, as I imagine many others would have done much better. You need a knack for it, which in and of itself means it should be low. To need a knack for a casual game like this is not something the game is striving for. Oh boy, the bullying of this game is never gonna stop, is it? I found that the level design gets more fun to me as I played the game more. Does this mean I simply started to understand how the game worked and thus started to see its genius? Or did it simply get better over time? I don't know. Some of the later levels definitely started to break away from the norm of just walking around seen in the first few levels and added a nice change of pace, though it felt like it all happened near the end. Water levels came in pretty early, but weren't particularly mind-blowing, and once winged Pikmin were found, we started getting into some nice horizontal flying levels. But it seemed only after all the Pikmin types were discovered and played with a bit that the actual game started to get fun, with things like the snowboarding levels, escaping a flood and travelling along water. I really enjoyed these kind of levels a lot, but the pacing on them felt a little weird to me. But maybe it was since I played the game in 3-hour installments. As for the regular levels, the gripes I mainly had towards the beginning of the game link back to those control and mechanic issues I had from earlier. Something that I confused for quite a while in regards to mechanics and level design was the interactivity of the treasures. Every single one can be interacted with in 2 ways. You can either have Olimar directly touch them to collect the treasure, or have the Pikmin manually carry it to Olimar. This confused me early on, as I would often just forget only Olimar was needed for treasure. One example I specifically remember had a treasure which needed Pikmin to dig it out, then Olimar had to simply touch it. But because I saw an interaction to carry it, I assumed that was also a mandatory requirement. And because I didn't have enough Pikmin to carry it, I called it a bust and left, completely unaware that I simply needed to touch it with Olimar. With the screen here just being a straight path, I don't really see a real need for the Pikmin carrying mechanic to be an option here. I feel it would have been easier for me as a newcomer at that point to not even be able to interact with the Pikmin and the treasure after it had been dug out, as it would encourage me to actually touch it with Olimar. Or I could just stop being stupid, but still, oftentimes the level design makes it so only Olimar is needed, so having the option to have Pikmin carry it just seems like an extra act for the player to think about and then disregard. I don't know, maybe I'm in the wrong on that want, but it still was an issue for me. I also of course didn't like the placement of some creatures, as seen by some of my fights. The entirety of the elongated Crush Splat was an annoyance, as you were only given 6 blue Pikmin to fight it, and it has way too much health for that. Plus, sometimes hitting its weak spot caused Pikmin to plink off on the wrong side, thus getting killed on the way back to you, and then only 4 would respawn. Overall, it felt like an unfair and cheap, boring, slow battle. And other level designs made fighting some creatures a pain. I also hated the infinitely spawning creature sections, as they seemed like pointless padding to me. Sure, you could just skip them, but unless they're mandatory to progress due to some extra mechanic like bouncing on them, I don't see the point of it. And it makes my fighting efforts seem worthless when it comes to it. And then there's the moments of trying to maneuver a full Pikmin party through the narrow designs of some parts of the level. The underwater levels have this pretty bad, or anywhere with thorn vines, but I especially found this an issue in the last world, where you needed to be in the right spot to not get killed. But crushing Olimar and 20 Pikmin into that exact same spot was borderline impossible. Those kind of deaths felt cheap and unfair, which was a fairly common theme across my playthrough, unfortunately. That being said, through all the negativity, I did seem to have a good track eventually. There were many times where I had no comments about the level design, meaning they must have been doing their job well. So, I'll be giving level design a 5 out of 10. When it was bad, it felt really bad, and it was common. But I guess a good chunk of it was good, so I can't be crazy harsh. Good. Let me rephrase that actually. Oh, good! The boss fights in Hey Pikmin are good. So good! It's relieving to have such variety in a spin-off game, as each battle was completely unique and came with their own set of mechanics to work out and play with. I really enjoyed them. And thanks to the 2D nature of the game, many battles were open to work in forms unusable in the 3D main games. One in particular has you continuously falling down some kind of tunnel or mineshaft, which without Hey Pikmin's controls would have been pretty difficult to present. Additionally, the battles often integrated 3D in a way that wasn't gross to the eye and was actually quite satisfying to look at. It was able to effectively keep up with the two-dimensional gameplay of the game whilst making battles feel like a true battlefield of depth and strategy. Not to mention, the creatures weren't killed by simply throwing Pikmin at them. Each one needed some kind of weak spot exposed first, which sure is pretty standard, but doesn't mean I didn't enjoy it nonetheless. A very quick section, I must admit, but you've gotten plenty of length already. Bosses get a 10 out of 10. I really can't think of an issue with them. They're creative, fun, a little challenging, and intense. I don't think any deaths caused by them felt cheap either. All good stuff. And I don't even need to mention the final boss. Alright, now we've reached innovation, a category that judges a game through what it brings to the franchise, either as an introduction to new games or a faithful adaptation of its predecessors, depending on whichever it is striving to achieve. And Hey Pikmin is very much a game that's trying to bring something new to the series, whilst not straying too far from its originals. And it does this really well. Hey Pikmin is full of new introductions to the franchise, and it's quite surprising how much extra content there is in this game, especially when you compare it to Pikmin 3 actually. I mean, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Creatures, creatures, creatures! There's so many new creatures that it puts Pikmin 3 to shame. We've got multiple new trees of families, we've got reimaginings of old ones, we've got expansions of old families, not to mention a fully fleshed out creature log reminiscent of the Piklopedia. Additionally, we've got a whole bunch of new treasures to collect with Easter eggs and references galore, as well as more logs for them and another tab for 42 compatible amiibo, and as I mentioned before, level designs that tailor for new styles of play for the Pikmin franchise. Snowboarding, flying, falling, floating, fully fledged swimming. It's all really great, and I'm glad that such a small spin-off has been able to provide us with so much content to add to the Pikmin franchise. And it does it in such a docile way so as to not ruin the integrity of the original games by hosting the events on a different planet, away from the plans of the main game developers, and so allowing for more experimentation on this front. Innovation gets a 10 out of 10. It has done all that it can do to give to the franchise, and its faithful reappearing adaptations are very welcome in my books. Now, there is an element of replayability within the game, but I'm not really sure if it's meant to be a figurehead aspect of the game, like the other games try to emphasize. I mean, sure, there are additional rewards for completing a level multiple times. You can pass a level by simply finishing it, you can collect all the treasure in each one for your own satisfaction, and you can strive for a no-death run to get that gold Pikmin symbol on the sector select screens. And they do convince you to replay the game to get said achievements, but there isn't a lot of substance to the levels beyond that. There are no branching paths, or if there are very minor ones at the very end of the level to open up a secret bonus level in each sector, and the rewards to successfully complete each level 100% is non-existent. There's no real reward for your act beyond your own satisfaction. And it doesn't really leave a bad taste in my mouth, but it does take a little away from the player, and especially the replayability of the game. Sure, it is replayable, but if there's no reward, then why even bother? The levels aren't some broad puzzle to explore, and once you've done it once, you get the idea. If you do complete it a second time with all the accolades, that'll only be another second go through. Maybe more if you fail, but still, beyond that, there's nothing else to convince you to go back. Unless you really, really like that snowboarding level or something. So replayability gets a 7 out of 10. It is replayable, but it's not great. You get visuals and logs, but otherwise just satisfaction. And that's not enough for many people. The extras category. This is the aspect of the review where we look at what the game has to offer beyond the bog standard gameplay of the game. What little extras does Hey Pikmin bring to the roster of its content? Well, for a start, Hey Pikmin introduces us to an entirely new bonus in the form of the Pikmin Park, which allows us to actually find use and purpose for the army of Pikmin not being used as we collect more to our arsenal. It's a pretty simple point and click kind of minigame that sets the player up for rewards over time. It's not a fantastically detailed extra bit, But it's nice and simple enough to give players a little bit of purpose between levels rather than just scrolling through menus to get to the next one. Additionally, we now have many different types of bonus levels such as the Sparklium Springs in each sector, pitting Oliver and a select bunch of Pikmin with the task of grabbing balls of Sparklium that come flying on screen. This is just a simple little fun mini-game to give a quick sense of satisfaction to the player, and is a new type of format for the Pikmin that probably won't translate fantastically to the 3D game, so it's nice that something innovative found its place here. It's a nice little thing. We also get the fan favourite return of the Piklopedia in the form of logs, detailing Oliver's thoughts and opinions on each of the creatures and treasure found, including logs on each of the Pikmin types and the quirky names of even characters from other franchises thanks to the compatibility of some of the amiibo sets. Other extras that come to mind are the simple little secret spots, which are tiny bonus levels pitting Oliver against a single puzzle to access a Pikmin pellet or amiibo treasure. It's a very small little extra, but it's nice to see. After all, it is an extra. An unnecessary little bonus for the player that the developers did not need to integrate into the game, but chose to just for the sake of the player. And many of these extras are pretty innovative in just how unique they are to what we've had in the past of the Pikmin franchise. They truly make the most efficient use of the 3D dynamic of this game. Extras gets a solid 10 out of 10. There's a lot of bonus content for the player, and though some extras are simple, that's okay. They weren't a necessity in the first place, and besides, if it's not broken, don't fix it. Appreciate it. And finally, polish. This is the classic category that depicts whether a game functions as highly and as fluidly as intended. A game could be the greatest of all time, but if it's buggy, then it should be shot down. And hey, Pikmin actually stands pretty well on its own 2 feet. The only times I can really truly remember moments of frustration came from either the smallest mobility issues with a leaf platform in one particular level and the unpredictable bouncing against certain creatures. The only other qualms I've had with the polish of the game came from the actual developer designs rather than bugs in the system. In this case, I'm referring to the button hitboxes and throwing Pikmin instead of hitting the button. But I won't dock points for this issue as it isn't a polishing issue, rather a developer choice issue. So with that being said, polish gets a 9 out of 10. It's not buggy, only slightly twitchy. All my other problems come from core design. So with all that said, we now have the points from all categories, and combining them all together gives us our final Hey Pikmin score of 78 out of 100. According to my reviews of both Pikmin 2 and 3, this game is just a smidge below, but 7 out of 10 is not a terrible game by any means. When Hey Pikmin does good, it does fantastic, but some core design choices really gave me a hard time during parts of my experience with the game. Nevertheless, this game truly isn't the tragedy many thought it would be when it was first announced. It's a spin-off Pikmin game, but it owns that title well and has given us way more content than any of us expected. And oddly enough, the 2D aspect actually aids the franchise in a lot of ways, introducing us to new formats that were previously impossible beforehand. I quite enjoyed Hey Pikmin, and if it remains as an occasional filler between main game Pikmin installments, then I would greet future sequels to this game with open arms. Hey, you did a pretty good job. If you like this review and the kind of content I make, consider donating to my Patreon or joining me on the next live stream. Any kind of direct support you send me will help me stand on my own 2 feet. I'm way too small to survive on YouTube's AdSense alone anymore, so I desperately need you and your generosity to survive. I'm not joking, sorry. I'm doing the best I can to stay afloat, but this is a very heavy uphill battle, especially with this adpocalypse going on, so anything you can give will seriously save me for another few weeks online. Anyway, I should stop begging for now. I'll see you around sometime soon again for another big review from DazzReviews. For now though, my name's been Daz, you didn't really care, and I'll see you in a bit.